With so many new developments, a new Q&A is warranted. And by now you probably know the drill. My name is Shirwan and welcome to Caspian Report, where we will go over the political questions submitted on Patreon. So let's get straight to the point with question number 1 by Daniel. What do you think will be the geopolitical effects of a no-deal Brexit on the European Union and on the world? Yeah, without a withdrawal agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union, Brexit would happen with no transition period, meaning suddenly London would find itself outside the single market of the European Union. And with EU laws and regulations no longer in effect, the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union would be imposed by the World Trade Organization. That is how economic ties between two parties with no agreements is guided. The World Trade Organization dictates the appliance of fixed tariffs. So, for instance, British exports would face EU tariffs ranging from 5% to 10% for specific sections like auto vehicles and agricultural goods. Upon applying tariffs, the EU would enforce customs control, which is likely to result in delays at borders and ports. Plus, as goods await inspection, supplies are bound to stack up, and as demand and supply dictates, prices are set to increase. Technically, the British government could waiver the inspections to keep traffic moving, but such a bill would require the Europeans to do the same. As interesting this all is, the primary driving force of the British GDP growth is services, not exports. Services makes up about 80% of the economy and includes categories such as banking, insurance, legal counseling, accounting, advertising, and financial services. Businesses that provide such services now enjoy unrestricted access to the EU member states through the single market. A no-deal Brexit would require London to reach specific agreements to preserve such accesses. So, for instance, British firms that provide financial services, which make up about 6% of the British GDP, would lose their passporting rights and would need to apply for authorization in each country separately. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom would lose access to the European Union's free trade agreements with Canada, Japan, South Korea, etc. For international companies, therefore, there are genuine incentives to move some of their operations outside of the United Kingdom. So, next question by Kevin Watts, who asks about the Western misconceptions on China-India relations and what can be done to increase economic cooperation between the two and avert geopolitical rivalry. Well, most people in the West see China and India as incompatible. That is the greatest misconception. There was a time when France and Germany were considered incompatible. The two were geopolitical arch-rivals. But what happened immediately after World War II is that policymakers from Berlin and Paris reduced geopolitical tensions by taking away the political options of governments. Key to this was economic dependency. France and Germany started to need each other to complement their economic growth. This locked their policies in a mutual beneficial relationship despite the imposition of geography. Watch our report on the long peace in Europe for more on this. I will have a link in the description. But in general, the way France and Germany reconciled can be used as a roadmap for many other geopolitical rivals, including China and India. So economic cooperation is key to defuse tensions. Unfortunately, this is not likely to happen because following the utter destruction in Europe, there was real political and public will for change, and policymakers acted on that opportunity. In India and China, there is no such will for reconciliation. In addition, the United States is doing all it can to persuade India to ramp up its anti-China activities across the Indian Ocean. So even though geopolitical tensions can be tamed and kept docile, the political environment must be right to make that transition. And in Asia Pacific, those conditions are absent. Next question by Kert Pillman. Recent elections in my home country Estonia might have made it possible for a far-right conservative party to gain access to the government. The coalition talks are happening as I'm writing this. Nationalism and populism is on the rise everywhere in the world. What should be done by the more liberal and sane political forces to prevent and reduce this trend? Can it even be stopped in this age of misinformation and social media fear-mongering? Yeah, quite right. Politicians from all over the world are riding this wave of nationalism and populism, and before it can be countered, we must understand why the left and liberal order steadily lost power. There are some good books on this topic. I have a few as well. One that I found very useful is The Road to Somewhere by David Goodhart. It's sharp, well written, and even though the core book focuses on Brexit and Trump, parallels can be drawn to other societies. I found chapter 2 and 3 extremely useful. I highly recommend reading those. But to give a quick summary, the author Goodhart describes a fault line between the anywheres and somewheres, where the latter has been ignored by the political class for the last 3 decades. Goodhart categorizes anywheres as progressive individuals who hold non-traditional beliefs to national identity and have largely enjoyed higher education. Somewheres, meanwhile, did not have the means to go to university and ascribe their identity from where they live and who they are, whereas the higher educated anywheres define their achieved identity by their jobs and qualifications. In this framing, the stacks are against the somewheres. For the past 3 decades, the political elite has ignored their concerns regarding immigration, policy, regarding family policies, etc. Now they're hitting back. You really have to read the book to gain a better grasp of this situation. I will post a link to our Amazon store in case anyone is interested in acquiring the book. Anyway, to counter the summit of the nationalist and populist forces, instead of telling people what to believe or what is good for them, politicians need to learn to work with the expectations of the public, even if those expectations are distorted by misinformation or fear-mongering. So, more attention must be paid to how national identity is constructed, maintained, and threatened. Next question by Largezo. How should the Mexican drug war be resolved? And is there a realistic chance of Mexico becoming a failed state due to the continuing violence? Mexico's war on organized crime and drug trafficking started about a decade ago when the ruling cabinet back then sent thousands of soldiers and police officers into the streets to uproot the drug cartels. At one point, the Mexican government deployed some 45,000 troops in the operation, but the plan backfired under the weight of its own success. As trafficking activities eroded, the cartels began fighting back against the government, but also among themselves to gain control over the remaining trafficking routes and resources. So instead of one big fight, many smaller conflicts emerged all across the country. And with the balkanization of the Mexican drug cartels, violence skyrocketed. To give some context, in 2017 a record of nearly 30,000 people died from the cartel violence. Now, for a nation that is technically not at war, those are astonishing numbers. This is not to say that the Mexican government's efforts have been completely futile. Public safety, after all, has improved considerably. But the trouble is that just north of Mexico, there is a massive market for narcotics. The backbone of the drug trade are synthetic drug precursor chemicals, which are cheap to manufacture and compact enough to smuggle, and therefore generate a larger return on investment than heroin or cocaine. For instance, 1 kilo of fentanyl costs about, well, a little over $3,000 to produce, but it will generate over $1 million in the United States. That is a return on investment that you will find in no other business. It's just too lucrative to turn down. And as long as the high demand in the United States persists, there will always be groups that seek to enter that market. Now, I'm not going to address the cartels one by one, that would take too much time, but the second reason for Mexico's war on drugs is rooted in its geography. The country's mountainous frontiers have always acted as hotbeds for unrest and rebellions. Throughout Mexican history, the state attempted to subdue the geographically isolated communities, but never truly managed to exercise its authority across the entirety of its territory. The modern expression of this struggle is the war on organized crime and drug trafficking. Taken from this, to resolve the conflict, the Mexican government must overcome two factors that are beyond its control. So, next question. John wants to know about Rwanda, what to expect from its economic outlook in the foreseeable future, and what geopolitical factors are influencing this change. Rwanda's geopolitical factors are twofold. First, it must manage its ethnic diversity to maintain internal stability. In the years ahead, the country must foster deeper reconciliation. Second, it must manage its landlocked state. In terms of exports and imports, doing business in a landlocked nation carries greater costs. In order to mitigate these constraints, the government of President Paul Kagame is seeking to transform the country into the Singapore of Central Africa. I know that's a weird analogy to make, especially considering that Rwanda is a landlocked state, whereas Singapore is located on some of the busiest maritime routes in the world. Yet there are similarities between the two. Foremost, both nations are relatively small in size and lack natural resources, so an emphasis on trade and services makes sense. And frankly, there isn't much else to go on. Rwanda's surprisingly high stats in regard to economic freedom is the result of reforms meant to foster trade and the services sector. President Kagame has been trying to emulate Singapore's experience on everything, from urban planning to law enforcement. For instance, Rwanda's capital is one of the most orderly and cleanest cities in the proximity, and most of its entrepreneurs hold a business-friendly philosophy. Meanwhile, the government has made some serious strides in the fight against corruption and the enforcement of the rule of law, which is something that is in stark contrast to its neighbors. At the same time, to overcome its landlocked state, the government has set up statewide networks of fiber optic cables. Now, about a third of the population enjoys access to internet. All in all, the policies of Kagame have resulted in steady economic growth of about 8% on the average since 2001. That is not bad for a physical remote country that is landlocked. So if you want to understand Rwanda, one must look at President Kagame's fascination with Singapore. Next question, by Pete Smith. Could you provide an update about how recent migrants as a result of the war in Syria have been doing, especially in countries where they migrated in large numbers? Have they integrated at least fairly well? Looking strictly at the integration of Syrians, the situation differs in each country. In Turkey, most of the 3.5 million Syrian refugees live in slums and face social isolation. The Turkish government is still working to provide infrastructure, transportation, schooling, security, and other public services to the refugees. Meanwhile, in Germany, Sweden, Austria, the Netherlands, etc., the governments are implementing mandatory integration measures, which include language courses and the assessment of technical skills. Italy and Greece, however, lacking in political commitment, have largely neglected to set up similar procedures. Taken as a whole, the process of integrating Syrian refugees differs in each state, but there are overlaying issues that apply to all. First, Syrian refugees experience social, cultural, and economic challenges. All three factors complement and undermine each other. For instance, active participation in the job market may promote social integration, but it can also lead to social conflicts with detrimental effects. As such, governments need to juggle between moving ahead with the necessary integration measures and the public backlash that could rise as the employment of refugees affects the job opportunities for the native population. So the integration process is inherently a political process where conflicting consequences must be considered. Hence, actions must be tailored according to economic and demographic conditions. There are, of course, Syrian refugees who have integrated fairly well. They work as doctors, engineers, and lawyers, etc., but they only present a small margin. Most Syrian refugees, about 80%, remain unemployed, and that number is kept deliberately so as not to spook the labor market and to create public backlash. Currently, there are two primary action plans by the EU and the UN that seek to gradually integrate the Syrian communities in the European job market. However, these plans went only in effect in 2016 and 2018 respectively, and it will take years to see the fruits of that effort. On the other hand, however, both the EU and UN roadmaps lack any kind of measures that address the long-term cultural aspects of the integration process. So, as of now, it's way too early to speak of any kind of integration, really. It's only getting started. It will take years to see the result of this. It's a long-term plan. Next question by Patrick, who asks about the UK and EU relations in regard to the Brexit negotiation process and what my opinion is regarding an independent Scotland and a united Ireland in the future. The initial bill of Brexit will cost the UK government about $48 billion over the next 45 years. That sum is the culmination of all the legal obligations prior to Brexit, but technically London could simply refuse to pay that sum. Instead, the British government could seek to redirect that money to compensate for the domestic losses due to Brexit in form of subsidies. And as tempting as that sounds, doing so would hurt the UK-EU relations and make it even more difficult to negotiate bilateral agreements with the European member states. So how bad the relations get between the two ultimately depends on London's behavior. As regard to Scotland and Ireland, Brexit has not created but exposed the centuries-old uncertainties within the British Isles. The economic benefits of the EU's free trade zone was not evenly distributed, and Brexit is now institutionalizing a massive social fault line between those who benefited from the system and those who lost ground. The resentment between the two will remain visible in the years to come. Brexit is also coming at a time when the question of the British Isles is reopening. In Scotland, about 45% of the population voted to leave the United Kingdom in the 2014 referendum. That issue, like Brexit, is still very much alive. On top of that, the Irish question has also emerged and is now opening old grievances and threatening the fragile peace in the region. So, like I said earlier, Brexit is exposing the historical uncertainties within the British Isles, and that is going to continue. Next question: what are your thoughts on the outcomes of China's increased involvement in the continent of Africa? Well, as China's GDP surged, demand for natural resources and job creation forced the country to look beyond its immediate borders. Africa at the time made sense, and it still does. However, Chinese presence in Africa is a double-edged sword. It brings in investment and provides cheap goods to African societies and thereby improves their quality of life. On the other hand, Chinese businesses and exports are forcing indigenous African firms to downsize their own activities. Last year, during a forum in Beijing, China pledged about $60 billion in loans and grants. What's interesting here is that the Chinese also revealed plans to invest in healthcare, education, schooling, cultural exchanges, etc., and basically for ways to increase non-resource imports to Africa. That's all very promising and all, but it still remains to be seen how much of that is actually fulfilled. For now, there is no denying that Africa is the world's wealthiest continent in terms of raw materials, and that fact is encouraging a new race among major powers to consolidate their hold on Africa. Besides China, there is also the United States, there is the European Union, but there is also Turkey, France, Japan, India, there is Morocco, there is Iran, there is the United Arab Emirates, etc. So by no means is China's influence over Africa a fixed truth. Next question. As the world's reserve currency, US dollar, how much longer can the US use it as a way to dictate foreign policy? Already, allied nations have complained, and due to the crisis in Venezuela, companies like HSBC Bank, Britain, have been threatened on being blocked out of the US financial markets. So even US allies are affected, since the inability to operate in dollars is like a death sentence. Well, one of the primary conditions for a world reserve currency is that the nation that holds the currency must be secure and politically stable. It's not just about commerce. So, to give some comparison, let's briefly look at the alternatives to the US dollar. The euro's stability depends on the stability of the European Union, but the bloc is constantly being challenged from within, which carries a risk for those who hold euro-denominated debt. China, meanwhile, faces internal tensions due to the economic disparity between its coastal and interior regions. In addition, the country's economy remains at the mercy of others due to its export-oriented policy. Its currency, therefore, is no good. Neighboring Japan isn't doing much better. In terms of GDP and net wealth, it is the most indebted, high-income country in the world, and it faces low economic growth for the next decade. The risk-benefit ratio of the yen is stacked against it. In South Asia, India is catching up quickly, but the country has more internal complications than any other major economy, which hampers further growth. As a result, holding rupee-denominated debt carries more risks than benefits. Finally, in Russia, the value of the ruble has been fluctuating greatly due to an overdependence on hydrocarbon exports. So, since creditors have nowhere else to turn to for risk-free money than the United States, the demand for the dollar will remain a constant, albeit with reluctance from the global community. So, next question. Diagon wants to know about the mass shooting in New Zealand and the Netherlands. Do you think these events may lead to rapidly growing escalation and new attacks across the globe in the near future? These specific attacks will not inspire a new wave of attacks across the globe. As terrifying as the New Zealand attack was, it does not compare to 9/11 or the London bombings or the Paris attacks. Those events set in motion geopolitical developments that have endured to this day. Extremist sentiment, whether it's coming from Islamic jihadists or white supremacists, existed well before the recent attacks and will continue to occur in the future, likely in the form of lone wolf attacks. It is our reaction to such attacks that must change. We cannot allow ourselves to become secondary victims through media exposure. That is exactly the goal of these attacks. And with that, we're going to wrap up this Q&A session. Today marks Nowruz holiday, which is a pre-Islamic and pre-Christian holiday with roots in ancient Persia and Zoroastrianism. It's basically the celebration of spring, and it's a public holiday in Azerbaijan. You get to jump over a small bonfire, you paint some eggs, you plant some trees, the kids go out trick-or-treating, and stuff like that. It's basically a festival that combines Thanksgiving and Halloween. So happy Nowruz to all, and with that, take care and Sahel.